Right. First of all, Dan, Merita, thank you very much for the introduction. And I'd like to thank you all for the opportunity to talk at this IPCRI event today. And I think I'll start, perhaps maybe on trying to be a bit positive here, and the point you mentioned about the visionary plan that we saw from the Palestinian Authority just a couple of years back, looking at the forward-looking approach to state building. And this obviously received enormous amounts of attention, and it's sort of run its course, if you like. And so we, in the World Bank, as well as a number of other institutions, took that opportunity to reflect on what's been done, how do things look, how do they add up at this point. So I'm going to try and talk through some of those. And I think it's important also looking beyond the local context, if you like, and the Palestinian context, which is where we focus. We know the central importance of functioning institutions for viable states across the world. And for those of you, some of you may be familiar, the World Bank each year puts out a World Development Report on a key theme of interest in development. And we did one last year on conflict, security, and development. And it specifically notes as its key message, perhaps, that strengthening legitimate institutions and governance to provide citizen security, justice, and jobs is crucial to break cycles of violence. So, and restoring confidence and transforming economic institutions are a key part of such an agenda. And I think in many ways we've seen this demonstrated by the Palestinian Authority in recent years. Statehood itself, of course, is fundamentally a political issue. But the World Bank is keen to support Palestinians in their institution building agenda because we recognize that functioning institutions alongside a growing economy fueled by the private sector are two key parts for viability of the future Palestinian state. Now, when we were analysing and finding a way to look at the status of the state institutions, if you like, we were looking for a framework for analysis, and we have drawn on a policy guidance from OECD, which is entitled Supporting State Building in Situations of Conflict and Fragility. And that policy guidance identifies key state functions as strategically important, and it divides them into 4 areas. One is security and justice, the second, revenue and expenditure management, economic development, especially job creation, and service delivery. I'm aware that there are numerous debates over what's really important as part of a functioning state, so I'm not really interested here to try and get into the academics of that. But we found this a useful framework to use for our own analysis. And while that OECD guidance talks of 4 areas, I'm going to focus my remarks today on 3 areas, because the first one that I mentioned, security and justice, really falls beyond the remit of the World Bank, and I think it's better addressed by specialist institutions. But there's a lot of information out there about improvements that have been made in those areas. So I'm going to touch on the 3 areas of revenue and expenditure management, economic development and economic management, and then service delivery, and looking at how the Palestinian Authority is doing in these areas. I'm not going to try and be comprehensive, but I'm hoping I can pick up the areas that are key, and also see some, because of what the title was, where can we go with this, what's still to be done, if you like. I think also the context of the achievements to date needs to be kept in mind. There's a bit of, are they there yet? Have they reached a level? There isn't a clear there to be at, I think. And we have to recognize that countries around the world are in need of reform. We can watch the news every day and see massive reform challenges facing many countries. So I think the incredible reform efforts that have been made here are all the more applaudable, I guess, given the context here. But our analysis, in a nutshell, has shown that the Palestinian Authority public institutions perform as well as a number of World Bank client countries of similar income levels. And this is in spite of the continued restrictions which have a detrimental impact not only on economic growth, but also they provide political constraints for a government to take even tougher reform measures. Anyway, if I could start on issues of revenue and expenditure management. This is the sort of thing we like to talk about in the World Bank, of course, quite a lot, and with our colleagues from the IMF. But I really think it is it's the fundamentals of how a government can run in managing its finances effectively and efficiently, covering its costs and delivering services to citizens. So it's really quite, it's absolutely key. And what we saw in the PA is there was a strong push to get the basics right, dealing with issues such as budget execution, controlling revenues and spending, the very basic that allows service to citizens to be provided. As most of you are aware, and as I think is really getting quite a lot of press coverage these days, the PA is constrained in its control of customs revenues because of lack of access to border control points. However, despite these problems, we see the PA moving on a 3-year plan to broaden the tax base, as well as strengthening supervision of border crossings. So there's been quite a lot of progress in a number of areas, and if you look at the budget numbers, you see increased revenues. But a key issue, and maybe this does seem rather optimistic under the current scenarios, is stronger cooperation between the relevant departments of the Israeli authorities and the Palestinian authorities on a number of details on customs and revenues. For greater data sharing, we've heard in the past there's been sort of at a technical level agreement, but clearly this needs a much stronger push. And I don't think the climate is right there right now, but inshallah it's coming. Also on tax administration, the Palestinian Authority has made great progress, particularly looking at large taxpayers. And I think one of the key issues now as they look at their challenges with donors supporting a large part of the recurrent budget of government is to broaden the tax base and to continue to improve their own tax administration, the collection of taxes and those sorts of things. So that's where we would see a need for continued efforts going forward to reduce the deficit. Obviously you need to see a broader growth in the private sector, so there are more people to provide those taxes, really to see sustainability for the future. Another area that I'm not sure if people are familiar with, where there's been significant improvements, is what's referred to as net lending. And this was based net lending. That's the terminology that I've only ever heard used here, actually. But basically, this was imports of electricity from the Israeli Electricity Corporation to municipalities, but the collection was not remitted back to the central authorities. So in effect, it was a fiscal transfer, basically, from the central authorities to the local authorities in an unmanaged way. But this has been tightened up a lot. It was a fiscal strain for the Palestinian Authority. This has really been tightened up a lot with local distribution companies for electricity, and so it's moving forward, and the municipalities are having to get on top of their finances. I think one could argue that the most impressive part of the financial management reforms has been the establishment of the Ministry of Finance's authority to supervise public finances and build systems and capacities to manage funds. This has translated into greater trust in the way public finances are managed and has helped improve service delivery. Needless to say, there are still challenges. The PA started with a lot of attention to execution of the budget, and quite rightly so, but now they need to focus more attention on budget preparation. Transparency issues are also important, and they've got a new accounting system which will allow for greater transparency in budget reporting. So these are all very important. They might sound rather detailed, but I think they're key parts of moving forward. We've heard much of the fiscal crisis facing the PA, and indeed, there were severe fiscal problems before the issue with the clearance revenues that's now haunting them, I suppose. And deficits have been running at over 20% of GDP in recent years, largely funded through donor support, of course. But as we see reductions in international aid, there will be a continued need for careful attention to priorities in spending and prioritization of the use of donor assistance. So this is another area that's going to require a focus of the authorities. I'll just very briefly touch on the civil service, of course, an important part of functioning government, and it's seen its ups and downs over the years in terms of quality and numbers. And challenges, there are challenges, but I think going forward the main thing will be managing the wage bill. Efforts are being made to limit growth in the public sector, and the most recent data we have indicates a total permanent staff of 152,000 civil servants. That's close to 80,000 in the West Bank and 63,000 in Gaza. These numbers do not include additional staff hired by the de facto authorities in Gaza. And without going into more details, perhaps the most pressing issue we could raise at this point looking forward is managing the wage bill. That is for public servants, because by global standards it's high at about 22% of GDP. So this is something that's going to really require their focus and attention. It's recognized, of course, that the exceptional circumstances here have contributed perhaps to this problem, but it will be important to continue to control the number of positions and ensure that staff are used effectively. There's a whole other area of public sector pensions. It's quite complex. There's people under different pension schemes. This poses liabilities for the future, and there has been some movement on a pension reform plan approved by the Cabinet of Ministers, but we haven't seen a lot of implementation on it yet. So again, that's another area that they'll need to tackle going forward. I'd like to move now to another set of the key functions I referred to at the beginning of economic management and economic development. We have seen in the last few years the revival of economic growth in the West Bank particularly, and to a lesser extent in Gaza. And while much of this attention can be attributed to generous donor support and some easing of restrictions by the government of Israel, actions by the PA have also been instrumental to bolster confidence of the private sector. Another very important institution, which I'm not going to go into the details here today though, is the reform of the Palestinian Monetary Authority, which has instituted a solid regime of supervision and regulation of the financial sector and played a pivotal role in the broader private sector development. When we talk about economic development, of course, the investment climate, is there a conducive environment for private sector to invest and grow, remains really vital. And it's a bit of a mixed story, I suppose. The closure system imposed by the government of Israel has taken its toll and will continue to do so. So without further easing of movement access restrictions, the private sector will continue to be constrained. And our analysis has shown that restrictions on the movement of goods and people increases labour and transportation costs and thus discourages investment. In many cases, Palestinian firms have adapted themselves, but the Palestinian private sector remains dominated by small family-owned businesses serving their local communities, towns or cities. So really seeing a leap forward in a way that you can really grow that private sector to support the future Palestinian state remains still a crucial issue. So you may ask, what is the good news? And this is where I think it's useful to look at some comparisons from beyond the borders, whatever those borders are. And according to Transparency International's Global Corruption Barometer in 2010, 59% of those surveyed in West Bank and Gaza say corruption has declined in the last 3 years, and only 27% say it's increased. And I think you should consider this in comparison to, say, Lebanon, where only 6% of people said it had declined, that corruption had declined, and 82% said it had increased. So, and looking at other areas too, we did a study on some corruption in information. Corruption does not seem to be a significant problem for doing business in the West Bank and Gaza. This is not the same in many of our client countries, I would say.
I have a family crisis. No, I have a family crisis. I just have to take this phone.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
And so I think credit should be given to both those in the Palestinian Authority and the private sector associations who have been backing anti-corruption efforts. Also, the 2011 Doing Business report, I don't know if you're familiar with this, it ranks countries against a certain number of criteria about the ease of doing business. And it ranked the West Bank and Gaza ahead of its neighbours Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon and Syria in 4 out of the 9 core indicators, including taxes and investor protection. But it also showed the West Bank and Gaza's ratings in starting and closing a business were near the bottom. So while there's been good progress, there's clearly still a lot to do in some of those areas. And then, we've said, I think, and the bank has commented numerous times that the bigger impact on the private sector would come from a bigger change in movement and access and some of the restrictions imposed by the government of Israel. But if we look within their own domain, the Palestinian Authority, a movement on certain relevant legislation will be important. And 3 of the laws, for example, that would facilitate Palestinian private sector transition to the manufacture of higher value goods as well as look for new markets, would be the investment law, the companies law, and the competition law. Their passage and implementation are key. I don't have the very latest, but I don't think they've been passed yet, to my knowledge, but clearly their passage and then actually implementing them. Beyond legislation, there are of course also issues of infrastructure development, very important for the private sector. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the details here, except to note that on water and electricity there has been some progress, but particularly in the former, continued efforts which are of course tied to the political situation and the ongoing conflict will be needed. Scaling water very briefly, I know it's a very detailed and complicated topic. On energy, there was a new electricity law in 2009 which is being implemented. There was the creation of the Regulatory Commission, the Palestinian Energy Regulatory Commission, and the establishment of regional utilities. This is in the north, the center, and the south of the West Bank, and Jerusalem, I guess. And this process has taken quite some time and is still rolling out, but it's certainly a very positive step in moving forward. And the Regulatory Commission remains a relatively new institution and obviously needs to keep moving forward, but so far I think it's made important progress. So the final area I'd like to talk about is one where citizens really, I think, look to their governments for effectiveness, and that's in the delivery of services. And while results are generally very positive, we do have evidence, probably due to some reductions in aid in the past and changing political circumstances, there has been some decline in the provision and quality of services in certain sectors. And this has required the PA to come in with additional support to these sectors, which in the long term might be unsustainable. So there are issues looking at sustainability. However, I think it's useful here to pick up on some statistics and compare the Palestinian results with others. Mortality rates, including maternal mortality rates, are lower than other countries in the region. Life expectancy is considered high for a country with the same income level. High immunization rates and relatively strong childhood nutrition indicators also prevail. Education indicators are also favourable. The enrollment rate has been high over the last several years, on average approximately 90%, with notable growth in student numbers since 1994. The secondary school enrollment rate is also high. It's actually approximately 20 percentage points higher than the rate found on average in middle-income countries, and 15 percentage points higher than that found in other countries in the Middle East and North Africa region. So it's really quite, it stands out, I think, in a lot of human development areas as really good. School attendance rates are high. The West Bank and Gaza has one of the highest literacy rates of any country in the Middle East, North Africa region, and has the highest female literacy rate, over 90%. In higher educations, achievements have remained steady. 30% of young adults enrolled in higher education, more than half of whom are women. A figure that is high in comparison with middle-income countries. In terms of reforming on the education system, well, there's very good numbers. Sometimes I think the real issue is now quality issues and addressing those. And significant efforts are being made on teacher training, financial support to students, diversification of educational opportunities, and so on. We're looking at ways of working perhaps with some of the higher education institutions and looking at the link to the private sector. How do you make young people ready for jobs, for the job market, even while there's some problems in the job market? The relevance of their education is very important. And I think the Palestinian Authority has really shown its commitment to the human resources, which of course are so important for the future. Healthcare services warrant a mention here too. The PA has pushed for equitable access and high quality of services, and there's been a positive trend in terms of the public satisfaction of health services. However, healthcare and its financing is really an area that needs more attention. There are severe financial imbalances in the Ministry of Health's general insurance scheme and inefficiencies in spending on the wage bill, pharmaceuticals and outside referrals, which constitute a major burden on the PA budget. In terms of health service provision, there's a critical need to enhance the contracting of healthcare services so as to ensure minimum quality standards for the services required, cost effectiveness and competitiveness. as well as better contract management and provision for monitoring and enforcing standards. So there's a whole area of work to be done there under the provision of health services and its financing in a way that is affordable for the future, but also at the levels. Sure, we'll do that. Yeah. And another, I think, area where the PA comes out strongly in their achievements, as we know with the various crises in the world, and particularly those we see dissatisfaction in the Arab Spring and countries around in the region, there's a lot of greater attention by a number of governments to social protection support. And it's interesting to note that the Palestinian Authority is currently poised to be one of the most advanced, cash assistance mechanisms.
What system?
Cash assistance. This is a cash transfer social protection system, which can be easily scaled up in a crisis and help the extremely poor and vulnerable households. It's now aiming, through this cash transfer program, which is basically welfare payments to the poorest and most vulnerable, to reach out to poor households and increase the number of beneficiaries to 95,000 in the coming months. And you can imagine, we did a study on poverty data and found that 7 out of 10 people in Gaza are receiving some sort of welfare payment. This is not a good situation, obviously, but it is good to see that there is a system in place by the authority that is able to reach the vulnerable. And they've put in place a special formula that's deemed by the experts to be much better at targeting. So you can have some confidence that it is the poorest and the most vulnerable who are receiving that assistance. Obviously, fiscal affordability issues for the future, is this affordable and sustainable, will be very important. I briefly mentioned pension reform, a tough and complex issue to deal with in any country, I think, and the PA is no exception there. As I said, there is a plan to move forward. It's not moving perhaps as fast as it could, so that would be an area. And a final area that's extremely important in the provision of services, and which I'm going to be very brief on, is local governments, of course, and municipalities. As I'm sure you're aware, that many of the municipalities that existed before the Palestinian Authority and are key in local services. And there are a number of efforts underway to improve municipal services. It will take time. There's things about revenue management and efficiency and prioritization. Transparency is also, of course, extremely important. And some efforts to date have allowed municipalities to improve here, and an estimated 56% of municipalities now publicly disclose their financial data and budgets, and 60% have disclosed their performance ranks. There's a system of ranking municipalities, so I don't know if it's the top 60% who disclosed, but presumably. Anyway, but I think this is really important at the local level. It's a citizen interaction with their authorities. And finally, we see evidence of municipalities increasing their focus on their citizens as customers through establishing citizen service centres. Municipalities are trying to serve citizens using a more private sector approach, if you like. And the bank is actually responding now, the World Bank, to a request from the Ministry of Local Government to do some more detailed analytical work looking at social accountability and how that can be built in at the local level. So you have more of a feedback from the citizen in terms of service provision. So this was sort of a broad brush on a few key areas that we have looked at in the analysis. And as I'd said, we believe the Palestinian Authority has done an extremely good effort on its plans and its state-building agenda. There is more to be done, as we said, but in comparison to a number of our other client countries in the region or beyond, a similar income level, we certainly feel the Palestinian Authority fares favourably. And while there are continued areas for reform and investment, I think these seem no more formidable. I'm talking on these limited dimensions, not the political dimensions. I'd say they're no more formidable than many other countries with whom we work. Thank you.